600 years before Christ, in Babylon, a tyrant king ruled mercilessly until one day he came face to face with Jesus. Many people are unaware that Jesus appeared in the Old Testament. This event occurs in the book of Daniel, set in Babylon, a region governed by King Nebuchadnezzar. He was a proud and cruel tyrant who took great pleasure in torturing his victims. After subduing Syria, he turned his attention to Egypt, his main adversary at the time. Judah stood in his way, and he knew he had to eliminate it if he ever wanted to fulfill his ambition of ruling over a great empire. Nebuchadnezzar issued an order to train a number of young Jews to serve him as men of knowledge and wisdom. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were among those taken captive. They became known as Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king ordered the creation of a colossal statue made of gold. It stood 90 feet tall, possibly intended to consolidate his power by gathering all levels of his court for a grand ceremony. These rulers were to attend the dedication of the statue and bow down to worship it. Anyone who disobeyed faced being thrown into a blazing furnace and burned to a crisp. Everyone obeyed Nebuchadnezzar's orders, as he was determined to establish himself not only as the undisputed political leader of Babylon but also as the supreme religious authority in the city. However, 3 men in the room refused to bow down, despite everyone else doing so. Many people cannot imagine the social pressure they faced. Certain Chaldeans saw the Hebrew youth standing among the bowing crowd and ran to report them to Nebuchadnezzar out of jealousy. These officials saw an opportunity to eliminate Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and did not hesitate to do so. When Nebuchadnezzar learned of the situation, he flew into a rage. Surprisingly, he gave the accused a chance to respond to the charges against them, which may indicate his regard for them. However, the king would accept only total compliance. They had 2 options: worship the giant golden idol or perish in the fire. Despite Nebuchadnezzar's previous praise for the Hebrew God, he added, "Who is the God who can deliver you from my power?" Eventually, this question, like before, would be answered. Daniel 3 verses 13 to 14 states, "Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, 'Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up?' These brave Jewish men defied the king's direct order and entrusted themselves to God. Their response was quite remarkable. "If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Daniel 3 verses 16 to 18. In other words, they preferred to die rather than disobey God. They were prepared for this day for a long time. Then Nebuchadnezzar, filled with fury, ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. He commanded strong men in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. These 3 men were thrown and fully clothed, and the fire was so intense that it killed the soldiers who took them. Yet, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the blazing furnace, still bound. The king was astonished when he saw what happened and exclaimed to his counselors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, your majesty." "Certainly, your majesty," he replied. "Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God." When Nebuchadnezzar saw the men walking in the fire, not only was he amazed that they emerged unharmed, but he also found it astonishing that there were 4 of them. The 4th seemed to be a son of God, implying that he was the Christ. Nebuchadnezzar tells us that the 4th person was a son of God. During the most challenging part of their ordeal, Jesus was there with them, physically in the midst of their trial in the fiery furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego may or may not have been aware that the Son of God was with them, although there were moments when they were conscious of Jesus' presence in their afflictions. We read that I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire. Nebuchadnezzar also noticed that the 4 men were free while in the fire, only the ropes that bound them together were burned by the fire. God is able to astonish those individuals whose hearts are most hardened, not only against him but also against his people. He who made the soul can make its sword approach even the greatest tyrant. The furnace was large, so they had space to walk. They were unharmed, so they were able to walk. Their minds were at peace, so they were able to walk as in a paradise or garden of pleasure. The answer to this is yes. They were not striving to get out, finding themselves unharmed instead. They walked carefree amidst the flames, believing that the same God who protected them in the fire would also deliver them from it. Nebuchadnezzar made the mistake of thinking he was the most powerful being in the world, but here he encountered one who was more powerful than him. What effect would this have on him? He still had the audacity to demand that others worship him as if he had seen nothing. Then Nebuchadnezzar approached the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. The satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. When the king realized that the men he had condemned had been divinely rescued, he summoned them. Not a single hair on their heads was burned in the process. It's incredible that someone could have survived even for a second inside the furnace when so many others perished at its mere entrance. God can deliver us from a trial, or he can miraculously sustain and strengthen us through it. We are impressed by the unwavering faith of these men in the true God. Their response in the midst of the trial confirmed three things: their unshakable belief in the God of the Bible, their confidence in the God who is who he says he is and will do what he says he will do, and their faith, as revealed by their trust in the one who had the power to deliver them from evil. Their acknowledgement of God over the most powerful king in the world resulted in the revelation of God's supreme power to the unbelievers. Their faith shows that God is able to deliver us from our own troubles and trials. As Christians, we know that God is able to deliver us, but we also know that he doesn't always act in that way. According to Romans 5, God may allow trials and hardships in our lives to build our character, strengthen our faith, or for other unknown reasons. We don't always understand why we're going through a trial, but God simply asks us to trust him even when it's difficult. Job, despite experiencing incredible pain, almost insurmountable agony, and suffering, was able to say, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust him." We also know that God doesn't guarantee that we will never suffer or die, but he promises to always be with us. We should learn that in times of adversity and persecution, we should adopt the attitude of these three young men. But even if he does not, we want you to know, Your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. Daniel 3 verse 18. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a story of faith, courage, and perseverance. It reminds us that God is always with us even in the toughest times. When we face challenges, we should have faith in God and persevere in our faith without doubt. These are some of the bravest words ever spoken. The fact that the fire did not consume Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego astonished Nebuchadnezzar. The point is, when we walk by faith, we may face the fire of persecution, but we can be confident that he is with us. He will keep us moving. He will eventually set us free. He will save us forever. When we are persecuted or suffer pain, we can have hope because we know that this life is not the end. Life after death is our guarantee for all who love and obey him. Knowing that we will spend eternity with God enables us to rise above the pain and suffering we experience in this life. For centuries, children and adults have been captivated by the incredible story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, three youths who faced the mighty king Nebuchadnezzar. The actions of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel represent a response that is common in our time: civil disobedience. This implies deliberate personal opposition to a governmental decree that violates God's standards. Certainly, the king would never be the same again. He abandoned the God he had worshipped in favor of the God of the people he had previously persecuted. He praised the Lord and insisted that his subjects worship no one but the Almighty God. Pious leaders should regularly ask the Lord to show them glimpses of his power and glory. When he does so, it becomes much simpler to channel our zeal into serving the one true God. Daniel 3 verses 28 to 30 says, Nebuchadnezzar responded, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants who trusted in him. They violated the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree: any people, nation, or language that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Jesus is mentioned several times in the Old Testament, although not by that name, nor does he appear in the same manner as in the New Testament. However, he is present in the Old Testament. Christ's presence in the Old Testament is emphasized throughout the Holy Scriptures. Jesus Christ validated the fact that the Old Testament contains references to him. In John 5 verse 46, when confronted by a group of religious authorities, Jesus explained that the Old Testament speaks about him. He said, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." According to Jesus, God's work with mankind from the beginning of time all points to him. Again, when Jesus showed that he is in the Old Testament, it was on the day of his resurrection. According to some accounts, over 300 Old Testament prophecies point to Jesus Christ and were fulfilled by him in his earthly life. These include prophecies about his unique birth in Isaiah 7 verse 14, his earthly ministry, and even the manner in which he would die. Jesus shocked the religious establishment when he stood up in the synagogue of Nazareth and read Isaiah 61, concluding with the comment, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." Luke 4 verses 18 to 21. The life of Joseph is another that seems to foreshadow the life of Christ. Many historical events of the Old Testament double as symbols of what God would do in the future through Christ. For example, God called Abraham to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham uttered these prophetic words in response to Isaac's question about faith, courage, and perseverance. They teach us that when we are faithful to God, even when it means facing persecution, He will always be with us. This story is also a type of Jesus Christ. He too was faithful to God, even when it meant facing death. He was crucified by his enemies, but God raised him from the dead. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is an inspiration to us all. It reminds us that we should always remain faithful to God regardless of the circumstances.